I would like to welcome you all to this seminar tonight, to this lecture tonight. Sorry, it's the Woolf Institute Lecture. It's where we invite prestigious speakers from the world of academia, politics, law, to talk to us at the Woolf Institute. And usually I'm quite sort of rebellious against my German heritage. I like to keep introductions very, very brief. German is very hierarchical, and you have these lengthy introductions. I like to keep it brief, but I'll make an exception tonight because we have this extreme privilege to have Dr. Anthony Julius here with us, who is the deputy chairman of Mishcon the Reya, law firm in London, who are very graciously hosting our London Research Day this year. And he's also a professor of law and arts at UCL. He's a highly regarded lawyer. His most famous representations included Diana, Princess of Wales, and her divorce, and Penguin Books and Deborah Lipstadt in a case that was brought against them by Holocaust denier David Irving. Anthony was actually played in that movie by Andrew Scott, which I believe is one of the most beloved actors, British actors at the moment, and certainly one of my famous beloved actors. He's Mishcon the Reya's most senior solicitor advocate, and he has appeared in both the High Court and the Court of Appeals, and he serves as trustee on several charitable and non-profit organizations. And he's currently writing a book on censorship of literature and the visual arts, and he's come to talk to us about that, on censorship. And
it reminds me of the joke with similar circumstances where after a very lengthy introduction going through all the academic distinctions and titles and publications and honours and so on of the visiting lecturer, the lecturer stands and with a tremendously ungracious scowl turns to the professor introducing him and says, "And of my famous modesty you've said nothing." So I mean, my modesty is not famous, and so I will not complain. I find myself in a slightly unusual position because ordinarily I don't write my lectures out. So I think that my experience has been that when one's looking down, one can't look up, and being unable to look up means being unable to engage with one's audience. But I was asked a while ago to contribute a piece to a new journal which is going to be published at the end of next year, and so I committed to that. It is going to be the first outing of a book I've been writing for 7 or 8 years now on censorship of literature and the arts, and I treated this very kind invitation as a deadline for me to write the first draft, and here it is. It's the first draft of my piece, and it's a terrifying 8,500 words. Now, obviously, nervous laughter in the room. Obviously, I'm not. Please let me assure you, I'm not going to read an 8,500 word piece, but instead, what I might do is I might talk a bit about my research project in a way which does not involve me looking down at all. And then if you will allow, I will read bits, because it's only that way that I can do justice to, try to do justice to this rather complicated and difficult subject, which I'm trying to, it feels to me when I'm writing that I'm trying to not just drag something up from the surface, from the very bottom of the sea, so it's not even distinct to me, but I have a sense of it, but I'm also actually, so to speak, trying to construct the wreck that I'm raising in the process of raising it, which anyone who's written will, I hope, understand what I mean by that. Just the sense that one has, both that it's a project one's absolutely committed to, but at the same time it's a project that one can't quite describe. It's very odd writing a book, and this is the 5th book, and but it's the same feeling every time. The sense that I want to say something, but I'm not quite sure what it is that I want to say. that combination of obscurity and desire, out of which, of course, a major surrealist film was made many decades ago, describes also, for me, the experience of writing. So when my firm hosted at the Woolf Institute, it was only a few weeks ago, there was a series of presentations by research students, and I think it was Miriam who began by saying that the practice here is to limit the presentation to 6 minutes, and I thought that was remarkable because it's such a challenge, it's such a huge challenge, and I asked myself, would it be possible to actually meet that challenge? And I thought, well, 6 I could manage, but perhaps it would be 6 hours. And then I thought, well, actually, maybe buried in that was an allusion to the famous encounter, which is related in the Talmud somewhere, with Rabbi Akiva, who I think it's at the time, where Rabbi Akiva is approached by a pagan who says, if you're able to stand on one leg and tell me the essence of Judaism, then I will convert. So Akiva, who's obviously game for the challenge, immediately hops onto one leg and he says, well, treat other people as you would wish them to be treated. And then he puts his second leg down and he says, now go and learn. Which is, it has its own charm as an answer. First of all, because of course it's kind of comfortingly universalist in its content, but also because it breaks the contract while fulfilling it. Because go and learn is an utterly open-ended injunction, and is the first lesson, so to speak. Maybe it's the second lesson that Akiva gives, which is actually you can't do justice to Judaism in that sort of glib way. So he both honours the bargain and creatively violates it. I rather like that, and it's a kind of what should I say? It's the sort of, with all due respect to the difference between Akiva and me, it's the which there are many, including what I hope will be my end as opposed to his. But it feels to me a good way to proceed. You say very quickly what it is that you want to talk about, and then you take the time that you're allowed without feeling that you have to give some second and similarly summary set of propositions. So let me very quickly say, but without actually standing on one leg, just imaginally standing on one leg, let me quickly say what I want to talk about, and what I think will be even less than 6 minutes. In the business world, people talk about an elevator pitch. The principle being that you should be able to say what you want to say. You should be able to deliver your message in the time that it takes to get from the ground floor to some, notional upper story, the third floor, the fourth floor, whatever. And if you can't, then you don't actually know what it is that you want to say. So this is the proposition. The proposition is that in 1989, among the many changes in the world that 1989 brought in the history of the censorship of the arts, there were three decisive events. And they were so decisive that you can actually talk about a whole conjuncture, a whole censorship conjuncture ending and another one beginning. And those events were the collapse of communism in a very summary form, the fall of the Berlin Wall, as a kind of metonym of that whole process. The Rushdie affair, and a whole series of American arts-related censorship stories. The prosecution of the curator of the Robert Mapplethorpe ex-portfolio, the photographer Mapplethorpe, who just died actually before the prosecution started, the huge fuss in the States about the another photographic work by Andres Serrano, Piss Christ. The installation, What is the Proper Way to Display the United States Flag, by the artist Dred Scott, the Martin Scorsese film, The Temptation of Christ. Extraordinary the way these events grouped around the very same period of months that the Berlin Wall was falling and Rushdie was being hounded for the satanic verses. And it's something that I lived through myself, and it's something I've been brooding on intermittently since '89. I was interested in Mapplethorpe from before '89. I was fascinated by its satanic verses and by Rushdie's career, read him from when he first started writing, and I was absolutely the last generation of people, students in that generation, to be beguiled and fascinated by Marxism. I mean, when I was here in 74 to 77, we studied Althusser and the Frankfurt School and Sartre, and my room was stacked high with New Left books, and it felt like a tremendous new dawn for Marxism, and of course it was in fact the final decadent flowering of the last generation of Marxist thinking. But all of that came together in 89-90, and I've been trying to understand it ever since, and what I'm writing now is my attempt at a reckoning with those events. That's it. That's the 6 minutes. In fact, maybe slightly less than 6 minutes. Let me now dive in and read a couple of pages, and then I'll look back up again. 31 years after the event, we have still not come to terms with the fatwa against Salman Rushdie announced on 14th February 1989. It remains under-examined. A proper reckoning has to address the following 4 questions. First, that the fatwa amounted to an attack on the novel as a form, as a literary form, indeed on art itself, and that thereafter, for no doubt complex reasons, arts censorship returned in new and old forms. We have a sense that when art is in the news story is often about its censorship. And we call this the question of art. It's the first question. Second, that the fatwa was a kind of signal announcement of a certain return of religion, a resurgence, of which resurgent Islam was but a distinctive instance, with proper respect. That's to say, paid both to adjective, distinctive, and noun instance. That it exposed for re-examination both the censoring practices of the major religions and the viability of the given liberal democratic settlement with confessional collectivities. More reflectively, we'd have to address the propositions that emerged so rapidly following the fatwa, and that are now part of the common sense of our times. First, that religion, conceived most broadly, constitutes a threat to the free practice of literature and the visual arts. 2, that religion does not comprise the only threat. 3, that religion does not only comprise a threat, it's also enabling of art. And 4, that the threat nonetheless is greater now than at any time since the mid-19th century. These are, in a sense, the cliches of modern understanding of religion, broadly conceived, in its various engagements with literature and art. And this is what has to be, so to speak, skeptically interrogated without commitment to any determinate outcome, and call that the question of religion. That's the second question. Third, that liberals were not equal to the challenge of the fatwa, that they failed Rushdie, and that they failed that unnamed collectivity which comprises creative writers and artists and their audiences. It once went by the name the Republic of Letters. No one uses that expression anymore, very few people do. If they do, they use it only with a sense of its kind of an antiquarian provenance. The fact that we can't name it as a collectivity is itself interesting. And that this failure of liberals, of liberalism, is of a continuing character, and it has implications for the liberal democratic order, and is part of a larger failure, and one which has emboldened liberalism's various enemies. We call this the question of liberalism. It's the third question. Fourth, that the coincidence in time of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the fatwa might mean something. I mean, one is not committed to the proposition that God is a kind of bad novelist, that he contrives history as an affair of meaningful coincidences. But nonetheless, there is something, one senses there is something that at any rate invites consideration. And that what that something is that it was the end of something and the beginning of something new. And remarkably, that's an intuition that the Satanic Verses itself explores. Rushdie was asked, what's the book about? And he says, in its most abstract, it asks, what are the conditions under which the new enters the world? And last thought on this question, if these 1989 events did end something, then when did that concluded thing itself begin? And the answer I give to that question is it began in 1857 for a whole series of other reasons: the prosecution of Madame Bovary, the Flaubert novel, the prosecution of Baudelaire's poems, Flowers of Evil, the passage of the First Obscene Publications Act, the collapse of Herman Melville's career as a novelist, with the reception of The Confidence Man, and so on and so forth. And that's the first chapter of my book. It's 100,000 words, and I'm terrified what you people say when I give them the manuscript. So I'm not even going to talk about 1857 now. But that's bit of the fourth of the four questions. Now, I had a sense in 89, in 90, of a turn for the worse in the censorship of the arts. Although literature and the visual arts should flourish in liberal democracies in several respects, I believe they are not now flourishing. Indeed, a certain wariness, even fearfulness, is detectable among creative writers and artists. Viewed from the perspective of the 1960s, the 70s, and the 80s, this is an unanticipated reverse. During those decades, life was good for the arts. To many of us over 50 in this room, I would suggest that it seemed that things could only get better. But we were wrong. The trajectory changed course, and I think it's fair to say that we now live in censoring times. There are more censors than ever before, fresh state agencies, newly empowered confessional and other identity-based groupings, news channels and websites that tolerate the narrowest range of political opinion, online trolls, and so on and so forth. The state most ardent in its advocacy of unfree speech is the second largest economy in the world. Of course, I refer to China. The reach and range of censoring practices has become wider and deeper. In addition to prosecution and regulation, writers and artists face physical violence, threats of violence, intimidations. Some of this is supported by a new vocabulary, cyber or internet sovereignty, cancel culture, trigger warning safe spaces and so on, some by familiar words in new and suffocating applications, respect, offence, perception, and some by a reinvigorated inherited vocabulary, blasphemy, sedition. And there are also many censors who act insouciantly, not caring to justify their coercions. The pervasiveness of self-censorship, which of course is very difficult to gauge, is silent testimony to a broad creativity stymieing fearfulness. So that's essentially my thinking on this. Where does this bring us in specific focus on censorship in liberal democracies? Two questions. First of all, how does a liberal democracy negotiate the collisions between what its own speech regime, so to speak, permits and what a subordinate speech regime permits? Blasphemy would be of small interest to liberal democracies today were it not given great weight in confessional communities. So at one end of the spectrum of possibilities, the difficulty is resolved by the state adopting the interdictions of the subordinate speech regime. I mean, we had this until very recently, where blasphemy was a crime, provided it was blasphemy within the context of the Christian faith. At the other end, it's resolved by the state protecting speakers sanctioned by this or that confessional community for breaching those interdictions. So does the state side with the confessional in defense of religious sensibilities, or does it side with the blasphemer, so to speak, against the sanctions of the confessional, the relevant confessional community? This is still, in a sense, it's an open question. Second, how does a liberal democracy adjudicate between the censorship practices of subordinate speech regimes, subordinate groups, when the regimes themselves come into conflict? There are speech acts prohibited, sanctioned by a confessional community, say, that are sanctioned or prohibited, that's to say the opposite, within the art world. The speech values of a religious community and the art world most generally conceived are usually quite different. Confessional communities tend to have a higher tolerance for what we might call heterophobic speech disparaging of the other, while the art world has a greater tolerance for blasphemous speech. The resolutions here comprise at one end of the range the state favouring one subordinate speech regime over the other, and at the other end the state refusing to get involved. In illiberal societies, the existence of censorship throws up no special puzzles. We expect those societies to censor, and that's indeed how we recognise them, but we don't expect to find censorship in a liberal democratic state. It's only in a liberal democracy that the censorship of literature and the visual arts is a surprise. How, indeed, can censorship thrive here, given liberal democracy's defining characteristics, regular, free and contested elections, a commitment to human rights and the protection of minorities, a competitive market economy, the rule of law, a vigorous civil society? We would expect the rule of law alone to rule out most censoring practices, partly because it's intolerant of public bodies enjoying judicially unreviewable decision-making powers, and is therefore intolerant of executive and administrative censorship, and partly because it's intolerant of laws that are unpredictable in meaning and application, and is therefore intolerant of legislative and judicial censorship. And yet, we know that censorship of certain kinds is pervasive in our society. That liberal democracies should be censoring now, and their writers and artists self-censoring, after their exposure to or emergence from the horrors of the totalitarian century, the last century, horrors sustained by stifling censoring practices, is dismaying and demands explanation. Let me pause for a moment, because I've said already quite a lot. What particularly interests me about this new censorship conjuncture is the way that it focuses on art. We are able quite familiarly to discourse about censorship, freedom of speech in non-art terms, and we're able to do that because there is a liberal language which is available to us, which we've inherited ultimately from the 17th century, and there are leading canonic texts that give us that vocabulary. Milton's Areopagitica, Milton's On Liberty, there are others. It is the signature doctrine, indeed, of liberalism, free speech. It's fundamental to our understanding of liberalism. And yet, liberalism, understood as a kind of determinate intellectual political tradition, has very little to say about art. And this silence, which actually can shade into a kind of approving nod at censorship, is deeply problematical, and yet was only latently problematical for centuries until '89. You find in Mill's work on liberty, which was written in the very year that Flaubert was prosecuted and Baudelaire was prosecuted and the Obscene Publications Act was passed, Mill says nothing about censorship of art and literature in the second chapter on liberty. And yet it was there, staring at him in the face. The passage of the Obscene Publications Act was hotly contested. Mill was a Francophile, read the French papers. The trial of Flaubert was relatively widely reported in any event in the London press. You would have thought that when Mill was writing the second chapter of On Liberty, which is all about freedom of speech, he would have addressed those questions, but he doesn't. And that silence, that failure or inability to write about the specific character of, let's call it art speech, in the family of discourses, science discourse, religious discourse, dissenting religious discourse, political discourse, this silence in respect of art discourse, which doesn't matter very much for 130, 40 years after On Liberty is written, suddenly matters hugely when liberalism is called on to defend Rushdie, and it looks, so to speak, at its texts, and it finds nothing. Now, what I want to do in the kind of ludicrously immoderate nature of my ambition is I want to write a text which is not just a history, but which, so to speak, fills the gap. I want to write not only a descriptive and historical account of censorship, I want to write something which has pretensions to the normative. I want to write a work which provides defences of free speech that put art speech at the centre, not at the overlooked or despised margin. And that's the ambition. Will I realise that ambition? I've been writing this book not for 6 minutes or for 6 hours or for 6 days. I've been writing this book for more than 6 years, and it feels like it's beginning to cohere. And the end of it comprises 3 sections which offer 3 distinct defences of free speech that put literature and the arts at the centre. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to defend art. Then I'm going to run through those three defences very quickly. And then I think I'll stop for questions. In a Paris Review interview conducted in 1983, Philip Roth proposed, reading novels, he said, is a deep and singular pleasure, a gripping and mysterious human activity that does not require any more moral or political justification than sex. In his implication, there is the intimation of, let's say, three distinct objections to engaging in any justificatory reasoning about novels. First, that doing so opens a space for contest and concedes too much. Second, that it elevates the standing of complaints about novels, which mostly comprise mere abuse. And third, it's liable to distract the writer, kind of self-mobilizing, but for an uncreative end. One wants to assent. Indeed, the impulse is to argue that Roth does not go quite far enough. Telling stories, listening to them are givens of human nature. It's what we do as a species, we know that. They're also givens of human understanding, essential to our making sense of our world. They make us, they situate us. They're constituted both of our species identity and our social identity. They're pleasures, for sure, but they're also needs, and needs should be self-justifying. Yet we cannot assent to Roth's proposition, in part because we know that needs are often not accepted as self-justifying, even when accepted as needs. Perhaps Roth concedes as much in his choice of analogy, which is somewhat subversive of his declared position, because at one time or another, as we know, every version of sexual activity, including the procreated marital version, has in fact required justification. And in part, because even if Roth's argument was compelling when made, it has wilted before the objection posed by the events of 1989. The reading and writing of novels can no longer be their own justification. How then should they be justified? More specifically, when they're attacked and their makers threatened, how should they be defended? A typical response has been to reaffirm the received liberal case for free speech. But this has quickly run into the difficulty that the arts occupy no more than an obscure, even problematic place in the canonic statements of that case. Liberalism began in defense of minority religious speech. It thereafter elaborated defenses of dissenting political speech, but it has yet to offer effective defenses of troublemaking literary and art speech. To make the same point in collective institutional terms, liberalism began in defense of minority religious communities. It thereafter elaborated defenses of dissenting political communities, but it has yet to offer effective defenses of troublemaking literary and art communities. It is just this work of development that I undertake. I want to offer a restatement of the liberal case for free speech, one which retrieves literature and the visual arts from the margin and places them at its centre. This means taking literature and the visual arts more seriously than liberals have tended thus far to do. And I ask the question, what does it mean to take literature seriously? But this is it seems like an odd question, but if one reflects on it, it's actually quite a difficult question, particularly since we associate the reading of literature with diversionary practices, distractions, something that one engages with, so to speak, recreationally. There is a incorporated in that understanding is a language, if not a disparagement, of some kind of subordination. Of the three defences, I'm just going to finish with the second, because this is the one that perhaps in this space is of most interest. And it's the defence which relates the religious communities to what I posit should be understood as the art world. That's to say, it supposes, and this is an argument one has to justify, but it supposes that artists and their audiences are to be understood in one sense as members of a collectivity, a community, which has something of the same characteristics as a religious community. And where those characteristics diverge from the characteristics of a religious community, I want to say they diverge to the advantage of the art community, the art or literary community. I want to say that the membership that we all have of an artistic and a literary community, the membership, so to speak, that we gain when we read a book and we enter into a kind of virtual relationship with the author and with other readers of the same book, and of the books that book comes out of, the whole tradition of writing that book, whatever it is, so to speak, an instance of. That kind of community, in its openness, in its lack of boundaries, in its exceptional tolerance, in its no price for exit or entrance, in its lack of anything which has the quality of coercion, is a kind of utopian version of a community, so to speak, yet to be. So, this is the, and I call it to myself, I call this defense the Jujitsu defense, not because I know anything about Jujitsu, or certainly not because I practice it, but because I understand from Jujitsu that it has something to do with using the strength of one's opponent against one's opponent. And so the reason that I call it Jujitsu is because I wish to use the strength, the claims that are made by confessional communities for respect, for deference, against them by arguing that art communities, as I define them, also deserve respect. And I found intimations of this position in interesting, unusual places, including in Hegel, in the early 19th century German philosopher. So, the Jujitsu defense. We must recognize the form of existence, the writer, the artist. People who pursue the literary art life are pursuing an estimable life, and the fruits of their pursuit, their literary and art works, should be protected. If we suppose that religions, confessional communities are to be protected, then we should also propose that art communities, in the way that I've defined it, the way that I've defined them, should also be protected. There are four versions of this argument, of this defense. One is premised on a parity between religious and art communities, and it takes the form, if confessional communities, then art communities. Call that the parity argument. The second version of the Jujitsu defense takes the form, free speech is the precondition to the artistic vocation. There is a morality of art speech. It's a professional or vocational ethic. It comprises obligations, it makes demands. Both obligations and demands are especially contentious. The demand made by writers and artists is for respect for their vocation, one which requires the fullest freedom of speech. None of this has anything to do with the seeking of privileges. The third version takes the form, if identities should be treated as a matter for continuous exploration, receiving at best only conditional and contingent statement, then art is exemplary in this respect, and free speech is critical to this exploration. Call this the reflexivity argument. This is a special case of the second version. It takes its own operations as a subject. In his novella Death in Venice, Mann asks, who shall unriddle the puzzle of the artistic nature? The way in which art works, literary works, take the artistic vocation, which is always a collective vocation, as the object of their own investigation, is part of this wonderfully open and reflexive nature of the artistic world, of the literary community. And in my view, it gives it at any rate an argumentative edge over the conventional religious life. The fourth version takes the form, the art community is the ideal community and the model for all given communities. The free speech that it needs is the free speech that we would all need for our ideal existence. That is, we cannot deny free speech to artists without denying it to ourselves in our ideal group existence. Let me end with a short passage from Hegel, because I don't think anyone should ever make any speech without at least a short passage from Hegel. Hegel says in the Philosophy of Right, a confessional community will sometimes demand the state should not only allow it to do as it likes with complete freedom, but that the state should pay unconditional respect to the church's doctrines as doctrines, whatever their character. The confessional community bases this demand on the ground that the domain of spirit as such is its property. And this is Hegel. But science and knowledge, he says, in general, also have a footing in that domain. I would add art and literature too. And with even better justification, may regard themselves as occupying the position which the confessional community claims. So, why is the art community superior? It's a community without legitimacy, legitimacy understood in this coercive sense. Literary communities are communities for anti-communitarians. They can never be a menace to society in the sense that so-called fanatical communities, or individuals from other communities, political, confessional, can be. They're not coercive. Better than a confessional community, better than any ethno-nationalist community, better even than a Republican, democratic, constitutionalist polity. It is time-bound. Specific formations, coteries, political, artistic groupings, and so on, they don't last. They have no transcendental quality. They make no transcendental claims. They are fully secular. They come into existence, they fade away. The art world is self-constituting. It does not require myths of origin. It has no sacred texts. It is non-exclusive. It is unbounded. There are no impassable barriers to entry. It is open to the world. I'm going to finish this.